Picture this: a young boy in Vienna, barely 5 years old, watching his father struggle to remove his hat as a group of men mock him on the street. The year is 1865, and little Sigmund Freud witnesses something that will haunt him for decades. His father, Jakob, tells him quietly that when a Christian knocked his hat into the mud and told him to get off the pavement, he simply picked it up and walked away. That moment of humiliation, that image of his father's quiet submission, would burn itself into the boy's memory and shape the mind that would revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. But this is not just the story of one man's childhood trauma. This is the story of how a curious child from the Jewish quarter of Vienna would grow up to become the most controversial figure in the history of psychology. The man who dared to suggest that beneath our civilized exterior lies a seething cauldron of repressed desires, forbidden wishes, and unconscious drives. The man who would convince the world that we are not masters of our own minds. Today, we're diving deep into the complete life of Sigmund Freud, and what you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about human nature. We'll explore how a brilliant student became a cocaine-experimenting neurologist, how a struggling doctor in Vienna developed theories that would scandalize the world, and how his revolutionary ideas about dreams, sexuality, and the unconscious mind would influence everything from literature and art to politics and religion. But most importantly, we'll uncover the dark secrets and personal obsessions that drove Freud to peer into the human psyche with such relentless intensity. This journey will take us through smoke-filled consulting rooms in Vienna, into the minds of hysterical patients, through bitter professional rivalries, and into the very foundations of what makes us human. By the end, you'll understand not just what Freud discovered about the human mind, but why his discoveries remain so powerful and so disturbing more than a century later. Sigmund Shlomo. Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, in what is now the Czech Republic. But to understand Freud, we must first understand the world he was born into. This was a time of massive upheaval across Europe, when old certainties were crumbling and new scientific ideas were reshaping how people viewed themselves and their place in the universe. His father, Jakob Freud, was a wool merchant who'd already been married twice before meeting Sigmund's mother, Amalia. Jakob was 20 years older than his young wife, and this age difference would later become a source of Freudian speculation about family dynamics. Amalia was barely 20 when Sigmund was born, and she would remain the dominant emotional force in his life until her death when he was 74 years old. The family dynamic was complex from the very beginning. Sigmund was the firstborn son, but Jakob already had two sons from his previous marriage, Emmanuel and Philip, who were closer in age to Amalia than to their father. This created a household where traditional family roles were blurred, where the lines between parent and sibling, authority and peer were constantly shifting. Young Sigmund found himself simultaneously the baby of the family and in many ways the centre of his mother's universe. Amalia Freud was an ambitious woman who believed her firstborn son was destined for greatness. She called him her golden boy, and from his earliest years she filled his head with dreams of fame and accomplishment. This intense maternal devotion would later become central to Freud's theories about the Oedipal complex, but as a child, it simply meant that he was raised with an unshakable sense of his own specialness. When Sigmund was 3 years old, the family's financial situation deteriorated, and Jakob decided to move the family to Vienna, the glittering capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Vienna in the 1860s was a city of contradictions, a place where magnificent palaces stood alongside overcrowded tenements, where intellectual brilliance flourished in coffeehouses, while anti-Semitism simmered just beneath the surface of polite society. The Freuds settled in the Leopoldstadt district, the heart of Vienna's Jewish quarter. This was a world within a world, where Yiddish mixed with German on the streets, where traditional religious observance rubbed shoulders with secular ambition, and where Jewish families struggled to balance their ancient heritage with their desire to assimilate into Austrian society. Young Sigmund was a voracious reader from an early age. While other children played in the streets, he could be found hunched over books, devouring everything from classical literature to popular adventure stories. His parents recognized his intellectual gifts and made enormous sacrifices to support his education. In a household where money was often tight, Sigmund was given his own room and an oil lamp for studying, while the rest of the family made do with candles. His academic excellence was evident from the moment he entered the Sperl Gymnasium at age 9. He consistently ranked first in his class, mastering not only German literature and history, but also Latin, Greek, French, and English. His teachers recognized him as exceptional, and his classmates both admired and resented his effortless superiority. But it was during these formative years that Freud first encountered the reality of being Jewish in a predominantly Christian society. The casual anti-Semitism of his classmates, the subtle discrimination he witnessed, and the story his father had told him about the hat in the mud all contributed to a growing sense that he was an outsider, someone who would have to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. This feeling of being an outsider would later become one of Freud's greatest strengths as a thinker. It gave him the ability to observe human behavior with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. But as a young man, it simply made him more determined to prove himself, to achieve the kind of success that would make his background irrelevant. At 17, Freud graduated from Gymnasium summa cum laude and faced the question that would define the rest of his life. What career should he pursue? In the Austria-Hungary of the 1870s, career options for Jewish men were limited. Law, medicine, or business were essentially the only respectable choices, and each came with its own restrictions and prejudices. Freud was initially drawn to law, inspired by his reading of political philosophy and his admiration for great orators. But a lecture he attended on Goethe's essay, On Nature, changed everything. The lecturer spoke about nature as a mysterious force that reveals its secrets only to those brave enough to investigate without prejudice. Something in those words ignited Freud's imagination. Here was a way to combine intellectual curiosity with scientific rigor, to unlock mysteries that had puzzled humanity for centuries. In the fall of 1873, Freud enrolled in the medical faculty at the University of Vienna. But from the very beginning, he was less interested in healing patients than in understanding the fundamental workings of the human organism. He was drawn to research, to the laboratory, to the possibility of making discoveries that would advance human knowledge. The University of Vienna was one of Europe's great centres of learning, but it was also a place where anti-Semitism was an open fact of academic life. Jewish students were often excluded from student organisations, faced discrimination from professors, and knew that their career prospects would always be limited by their background. Freud learned to navigate this environment with a combination of brilliance, determination, and carefully controlled anger. His early research focused on the nervous systems of fish and crayfish. He spent countless hours in the laboratory, dissecting specimens and making detailed observations under the microscope. His work was meticulous and groundbreaking, but it was also frustrating. The connections between nerve cells that he was studying seemed to follow no clear pattern, and the questions he was asking appeared to have no definitive answers. It was during this period that Freud first encountered the work of Ernst Brücke, the brilliant physiologist who would become his mentor and father figure. Brücke's laboratory was a temple to scientific materialism, a place where researchers believed that all biological phenomena could ultimately be explained through physics and chemistry. There was no room for vitalism, no acceptance of mysterious life forces or spiritual explanations. Under Brücke's influence, Freud embraced a mechanistic view of human behaviour that would remain with him throughout his career. He began to see the mind as a kind of machine, governed by forces and energies that could be studied, measured, and ultimately understood. This scientific materialism would later provide the foundation for his psychological theories, even when those theories ventured into territories that seemed far removed from the laboratory. But Freud's years as a medical student were not just about scientific training. They were also a time of intense personal development, of wrestling with questions about his identity, his ambitions, and his place in the world. He was a young man in a hurry, desperate to make his mark on the world, but uncertain about how to do it. His correspondence from this period reveals a brilliant but troubled young man, someone who oscillated between grandiose ambitions and deep self-doubt. He wrote to his friend Emil Fluss about his dreams of fame and recognition, but also about his fears that he would never amount to anything significant. He was already developing the habit of intense self-analysis that would later become central to his method of psychological investigation. The financial pressures on the Freud family remained constant throughout Sigmund's university years. His father's business struggled, and there were times when the family could barely afford basic necessities. Sigmund was acutely aware that his education was a tremendous sacrifice for his parents, and this awareness only intensified his drive to succeed. In 1876, Freud made his first significant scientific discovery while studying the reproductive organs of eels. He was the first researcher to identify the male reproductive organs of these mysterious creatures, solving a puzzle that had baffled naturalists for centuries. The discovery brought him recognition in scientific circles and confirmed his belief that he was destined for great things. But even as he achieved this early success, Freud was beginning to realize that pure research might not provide the kind of career he needed. Academic positions were scarce and often closed to Jewish scholars, while the financial rewards of laboratory work were minimal. He began to consider the possibility that he might need to practice medicine after all, not because he felt called to heal the sick, but because he needed to earn a living. This tension between scientific idealism and practical necessity would define much of Freud's early career. He wanted to unlock the secrets of human nature, but he also needed to support himself and eventually a family. The solution he would eventually find would involve creating an entirely new kind of medical practice, one that would allow him to pursue his research interests while also earning enough money to live comfortably. As he approached the end of his medical studies, Freud stood at a crossroads. He had proven himself as a researcher, demonstrated his intellectual brilliance, and begun to develop the analytical skills that would serve him throughout his career. But the path ahead remained uncertain, filled with obstacles that would test his determination and ultimately lead him toward discoveries that would change our understanding of human nature forever. The year 1881 marked a turning point that would reshape not just Freud's career, but the entire landscape of human psychology. After 8 long years of medical training, he finally received his doctorate, but the celebration was bittersweet. The academic world he had dreamed of conquering seemed increasingly closed to him, and the harsh realities of earning a living pressed down like a weight he could no longer ignore. Ernst Brücker, his beloved mentor, delivered the blow that would change everything. In a private meeting that Freud would later describe as one of the most painful moments of his life, Brücker explained the brutal truth about academic careers for Jewish scholars. There were no positions available, no prospects for advancement, and even if opportunities arose, they would likely go to Gentile candidates with inferior qualifications. The message was clear. Freud needed to abandon his research dreams and enter clinical practice. The transition from laboratory researcher to practicing physician was agonizing. Freud felt like he was betraying his true calling, trading the pure pursuit of knowledge for the messy, unpredictable world of treating actual patients. But financial necessity left him no choice. He took a position at the Vienna General Hospital, one of Europe's most prestigious medical institutions, where he would spend the next 3 years learning the practical arts of healing. The hospital was a revelation in human suffering. Here, Freud encountered the full spectrum of human misery, from physical ailments that ravaged the body to mysterious nervous conditions that seemed to defy medical explanation. He rotated through different departments, working in surgery, internal medicine, and psychiatry, but it was his time in the neurological ward that would prove most significant. Under the supervision of Theodor Meinert, one of Vienna's most respected brain anatomists, Freud immersed himself in the study of nervous diseases. He learned to diagnose strokes, identify brain tumours, and treat the various forms of paralysis and seizures that filled the neurological wards. But more importantly, he began to encounter patients whose symptoms seemed to have no clear physical cause. These were the cases that fascinated and frustrated him most. Patients who suffered from mysterious paralyses, unexplained pains, and bizarre behavioural symptoms that appeared and disappeared without any discernible pattern. The medical establishment largely dismissed these cases as malingering or hysteria, but Freud found himself drawn to these puzzles with the same intensity he had once brought to studying ill reproductive organs. It was during this period that Freud first encountered the work of Jean-Martin Charcot, the famous French neurologist who was conducting groundbreaking research on hysteria at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Charcot's approach was revolutionary. Instead of dismissing hysterical symptoms as fake or imaginary, he studied them with the same scientific rigour he applied to organic brain diseases. Charcot had discovered that he could induce hysterical symptoms through hypnosis, suggesting that these mysterious ailments were real psychological phenomena rather than simple deception. This insight would prove crucial to Freud's later development, but at the time it was simply an intriguing possibility that he filed away for future consideration. Meanwhile, Freud's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. In 1882, he met Martha Bernays, the daughter of a prominent Jewish family, and fell deeply in love. Martha was intelligent, cultured, and beautiful, but she was also proper and conventional in ways that sometimes frustrated the intense young doctor. Their courtship would stretch over 4 long years, delayed by Freud's financial insecurity and the demands of his medical training. The correspondence between Freud and Martha during their engagement reveals a passionate but troubled relationship. Freud was possessive and demanding, expecting Martha to share his intellectual interests and support his ambitions without reservation. He was also prone to jealousy and fits of depression when separated from her. These letters provide our first glimpse of the emotional intensity that would later characterize his relationships with patients and colleagues. Financial pressure continued to dominate Freud's thinking. His salary as a hospital physician was barely enough to support himself, let alone a wife and the large family he hoped to have. He began to consider private practice, but establishing himself as an independent physician would require capital he didn't possess and connections he had yet to develop. It was at this critical juncture that Freud made a decision that would have profound implications for his future work. He became fascinated by cocaine, a newly discovered alkaloid that was being hailed as a wonder drug with potential applications ranging from local anesthesia to the treatment of depression and morphine addiction. Freud began experimenting with cocaine on himself, carefully documenting its effects in a series of detailed notes that read like a combination of scientific observation and personal confession. He found that the drug enhanced his mood, increased his energy, and seemed to sharpen his mental faculties. More importantly, he began to see cocaine as his ticket to fame and fortune. In 1884, Freud published his first paper on cocaine, enthusiastically promoting its therapeutic potential. He recommended it for treating everything from digestive disorders to nervous exhaustion, and he began prescribing it to patients, friends, and colleagues. For a brief moment, It seemed like his cocaine research might provide the breakthrough he desperately needed, but the cocaine episode would ultimately become one of Freud's greatest professional embarrassments. While he was promoting the drug's benefits, other researchers were discovering its addictive properties and dangerous side effects. Worse still, a colleague named Carl Kohler achieved lasting fame by discovering cocaine's usefulness as a local anesthetic, an application that Freud had investigated but failed to pursue. The cocaine controversy taught Freud several crucial lessons that would shape his later work. He learned to be more cautious about making grand claims without sufficient evidence, and he developed a healthy skepticism about quick fixes and miracle cures. But perhaps most importantly, his cocaine experiments gave him first-hand experience with altered states of consciousness and the complex relationship between mind and body. In 1885, Freud received news that would change the trajectory of his career. He had been awarded a travel fellowship to study with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to learn from one of Europe's most innovative neurologists and to establish himself in the international medical community. The 4 months Freud spent in Paris were transformative. Charcot was everything Freud aspired to be: brilliant, famous, respected, and financially successful. But more than that, Charcot was asking the kinds of questions that Freud found most compelling. How did the mind influence the body? What was the relationship between psychological trauma and physical symptoms? Could mental states produce real, measurable changes in neurological function? Under Charcot's influence, Freud began to see hysteria not as a weakness or deception, but as a legitimate medical condition worthy of serious study. He watched as Charcot demonstrated that hysterical symptoms could be induced and removed through hypnosis, suggesting that these mysterious ailments were products of the unconscious mind rather than conscious deception. Charcot also introduced Freud to a radically new way of thinking about sexuality and psychological development. The French neurologist had observed that many of his hysterical patients had histories of sexual trauma or dysfunction, and he speculated that sexual factors played a crucial role in the development of nervous diseases. This insight would later become central to Freud's psychological theories. But perhaps the most important lesson Freud learned from Charcot was methodological. The French master showed him how to observe human behavior with scientific detachment, how to look for patterns and connections that others missed, and how to develop theories that could be tested through careful observation and experimentation. When Freud returned to Vienna in early 1886, he was a changed man. He had seen the future of neurology, and it involved taking the mind seriously as a legitimate object of scientific study. He was also newly confident in his abilities and eager to establish himself as an independent practitioner and researcher. Within months of his return, Freud married Martha Bernays in a ceremony that was both a celebration of their long courtship and a declaration of his commitment to building a successful medical practice. The young couple moved into an apartment on Rathausstrasse, where Freud established his first private consulting room. The early years of private practice were challenging. Patients were scarce, income was uncertain, and Freud struggled to find his niche in Vienna's competitive medical marketplace. He tried treating a variety of conditions using conventional methods, but he found himself increasingly drawn to the mysterious cases that other physicians avoided or dismissed. It was during this period that Freud began collaborating with Joseph Breuer, an older and more established physician who had developed an innovative treatment for hysteria. Breuer's method involved encouraging patients to talk about their symptoms and the circumstances surrounding their onset, often under hypnosis. He had discovered that simply allowing patients to express their emotions and memories could sometimes lead to dramatic improvements in their condition. The collaboration between Freud and Breuer would prove to be one of the most significant partnerships in the history of psychology. Together, they began developing what they called the talking cure, a revolutionary approach to treating nervous diseases that focused on the patient's psychological state rather than their physical symptoms. Their most famous case involved a young woman they called Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. Anna suffered from a bewildering array of symptoms, including paralysis, speech difficulties, and hallucinations. Breuer treated her using his talking method, and over the course of many months, her symptoms gradually improved as she recalled and discussed traumatic memories related to her father's illness and death. The Anna O case convinced Freud that psychological trauma could produce real physical symptoms, and that these symptoms could be treated through psychological means. This insight would become the foundation of his life's work, but it would also lead him into uncharted territory that would challenge everything the medical establishment believed about the nature of mental illness. As Freud delved deeper into the mysteries of the human psyche, he began to notice patterns that would revolutionize our understanding of mental illness. The talking cure was revealing secrets that had been buried for decades, sometimes centuries, in the deepest recesses of his patients' minds. But what he discovered would shock even him. The breakthrough came through a series of cases that seemed to follow a disturbing pattern. Patient after patient, when encouraged to speak freely about their earliest memories and deepest fears, began to reveal experiences that pointed toward a connection between childhood trauma and adult neurosis that was far more profound than anyone had imagined. One case in particular haunted Freud's thoughts. A young governess came to him, suffering from severe anxiety attacks and unexplained physical symptoms that left her unable to work. Through careful questioning and hypnosis, she began to recall memories of sexual abuse she had suffered as a child at the hands of a family member. As she spoke about these traumatic experiences, her symptoms began to improve dramatically. This case was not isolated. Again and again, Freud found that his patients' neuroses seemed to trace back to sexual trauma in childhood. The pattern was so consistent that he began to develop what he called the seduction theory, the idea that neurosis was caused by actual sexual abuse in early life. It was a revolutionary concept that would make him enemies throughout the medical establishment. But as Freud continued his investigations, he began to uncover something even more disturbing. Some of his patients were reporting memories of abuse that seemed impossible or highly unlikely to have occurred. The details didn't add up, the timelines were confused, and the alleged perpetrators were people who seemed incapable of such acts. Yet the emotional impact of these memories on his patients was undeniably real. This discovery forced Freud to confront a possibility that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the human mind. What if these memories were not actual recollections of real events, but rather fantasies created by the unconscious mind? What if the trauma that caused neurosis was not always external abuse, but internal psychological conflict? The realization that hit Freud was both liberating and terrifying. If his patients could create vivid, emotionally powerful memories of events that never happened, then the human mind was far more complex and creative than anyone had imagined. But it also meant that the line between reality and fantasy was much blurrier than he had ever supposed. This insight led Freud to develop one of his most controversial theories: the idea that children have sexual feelings and fantasies from a very early age. He began to argue that what his patients were remembering were not necessarily actual seductions, but their own childhood sexual desires and the guilt and anxiety these desires produced. The medical establishment's reaction to this theory was swift and brutal. Colleagues who had once respected Freud now shunned him. Medical journals refused to publish his papers. Patients stopped coming to his practice. He found himself isolated and professionally ostracized for suggesting that innocent children could harbor sexual thoughts. But Freud pressed on, driven by an almost obsessive need to understand the workings of the human psyche. He began to develop new methods for exploring the unconscious mind, techniques that went beyond hypnosis to tap into the deeper layers of human consciousness. The most famous of these techniques was free association, a method that required patients to say whatever came into their minds without censoring or editing their thoughts. Freud discovered that when people allowed their minds to wander freely, they often revealed unconscious thoughts and desires that they would never express in normal conversation. Through free association, Freud began to map the landscape of the unconscious mind. He found that it was populated by repressed memories, forbidden desires, and primitive impulses that civilization had forced underground. He discovered that the unconscious operated according to its own logic, a dreamlike system of symbols and associations that bore little resemblance to rational thought. This exploration of the unconscious led Freud to one of his most important discoveries, the interpretation of dreams. He had always been fascinated by his own dreams and those of his patients, but he began to see them as more than just random neural firing during sleep. Dreams, he realized, were messages from the unconscious mind, coded communications that revealed repressed wishes and fears. In 1895, Freud had a dream that would change the course of psychology forever. He dreamed about a patient named Irma, and in analysing this dream, he discovered what he believed was the key to understanding all dreams. Every dream, he concluded, was the fulfillment of a repressed wish, usually sexual in nature. This insight led him to begin work on what would become his masterpiece, the interpretation of dreams. The book would take him 4 years to complete, and during that time, he subjected himself to the most intensive self-analysis ever undertaken by any human being. Freud analysed his own dreams with ruthless honesty, uncovering childhood memories and unconscious desires that he had never suspected existed. He examined his relationships with his parents, his siblings, his wife, and his children, looking for the hidden psychological patterns that shaped his personality and behaviour. The process was emotionally devastating. Freud discovered that he harboured unconscious hostility toward his father, sexual attraction to his mother, and competitive feelings toward his colleagues that shocked him with their intensity. But he also found that this self-analysis gave him unprecedented insight into the workings of his own mind and, by extension, the human psyche in general. During this period, Freud's relationship with Joseph Breuer began to deteriorate. Breuer was uncomfortable with the sexual emphasis in Freud's theories and worried about the professional consequences of being associated with such controversial ideas. The two men who had once been close collaborators gradually grew apart, leaving Freud increasingly isolated in his pursuit of psychological truth. But isolation also brought clarity. Without the need to compromise or accommodate other people's sensibilities, Freud was free to follow his theories wherever they led, no matter how shocking or controversial the conclusions might be. He began to develop a comprehensive theory of human psychology that would explain not just individual neurosis, but the fundamental drives that motivate all human behaviour. Central to this theory was the concept of the Oedipus complex, named after the Greek tragedy in which a man unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother. Freud argued that every male child goes through a phase in which he desires his mother sexually and sees his father as a rival to be eliminated. The successful resolution of this complex through identification with the father and repression of the incestuous desire was crucial to normal psychological development. The Oedipus complex was perhaps the most shocking of all Freud's theories, suggesting, as it did, that the most sacred relationships in human society were built on a foundation of repressed sexual desire and murderous impulses. But Freud believed he had found evidence for this complex in the dreams, symptoms, and free associations of virtually every patient he treated. As the 19th century drew to a close, Freud was working feverishly to complete the interpretation of dreams. He knew that this book would either establish him as one of the great thinkers of his age or destroy what remained of his professional reputation. The stakes could not have been higher. The book was finally published in November 1899, though it bore a publication date of 1900, as if Freud wanted it to mark the beginning of a new century. The initial reception was disappointing. Reviews were few and mostly negative, and sales were abysmal. In the first 6 years after publication, the book sold only 351 copies. But Freud was undeterred. He believed that he had discovered fundamental truths about human nature that would eventually be recognized and accepted. He continued to develop his theories, refine his methods, and treat patients who came to him from across Europe seeking relief from mysterious nervous ailments that conventional medicine could not cure. The early years of the 20th century saw Freud gradually building a following among younger physicians and intellectuals who were intrigued by his revolutionary ideas. He began to gather around him a circle of disciples who would help spread his theories throughout the medical and intellectual world. Among these early followers was Carl Gustav Jung, a brilliant young Swiss psychiatrist who would become both Freud's most important collaborator and eventually his most devastating critic. Jung brought to the psychoanalytic movement a mystical sensibility and a broader cultural perspective that complemented Freud's more mechanistic approach. Another key figure was Alfred Adler, a Viennese physician who was attracted to Freud's emphasis on unconscious motivation, but who would later develop his own theories about the role of power and inferiority feelings in human psychology. These men, along with several others, formed the inner circle of what would become known as the psychoanalytic movement. But as Freud's influence grew, so did the resistance to his ideas. The medical establishment continued to view him as a dangerous radical whose theories threatened the moral foundations of society. Religious leaders denounced him as an enemy of faith and traditional values. Even his own patients sometimes recoiled from the sexual interpretations he placed on their symptoms and dreams. The controversy only intensified when Freud began to extend his theories beyond individual psychology to analyze entire cultures and civilizations. He argued that the same unconscious forces that shaped individual behavior also influenced art, religion, literature, and social institutions. Nothing in human culture was immune from his psychological analysis. This expansion of psychoanalytic theory into broader cultural criticism marked a new phase in Freud's career. No longer content to simply treat individual patients, he now saw himself as a scientist of human nature, whose theories could explain everything from the origins of religion to the causes of war. As the first decade of the new century progressed, Freud found himself at the center of intellectual debates that extended far beyond the narrow confines of medical practice. His ideas were being discussed in universities, debated in literary salons, and argued about in newspapers and magazines across Europe and America. The man who had once struggled to make a living as an obscure neurologist was now becoming one of the most famous and controversial figures of his time. But with fame came new challenges and new enemies, and Freud would soon discover that success in the intellectual world could be just as dangerous as failure. The year 1909 would prove to be a watershed moment that catapulted Freud from European notoriety to global fame. An invitation arrived that would change everything. Clark University in Massachusetts was offering him an honorary doctorate and the opportunity to deliver a series of lectures introducing psychoanalysis to America. For a man who had spent years watching his ideas dismissed and ridiculed by the European establishment, this American recognition felt like vindication. But the invitation also represented something more profound. America, in 1909, was a nation hungry for new ideas, unburdened by the rigid class structures and ancient prejudices that had constrained Freud's work in Vienna. Here was a chance to plant his revolutionary theories in virgin soil, to see what psychoanalysis might become when freed from the suffocating atmosphere of old-world conservatism. Freud's journey to America was his first and only trip to the New World, and it filled him with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He travelled with Jung and Sandor Ferenczi, two of his most devoted disciples, and the three men spent the ocean voyage analysing each other's dreams and debating the finer points of psychoanalytic theory. It was like a floating symposium on the unconscious mind. The lectures at Clark University were a triumph. Freud spoke without notes, delivering 5 brilliant presentations that outlined the basic principles of psychoanalysis in language that educated laypeople could understand. He talked about the unconscious, about repression and neurosis, about dreams and the sexual origins of psychological disturbance. The American audience was fascinated rather than scandalized, and Freud found himself energized by their enthusiasm. But even as he basked in American acclaim, Freud was growing increasingly concerned about the future of his movement back in Europe. The circle of disciples he had gathered around him was beginning to show signs of strain and division. Different followers were developing their own interpretations of psychoanalytic theory, and some were moving in directions that Freud found deeply troubling. The first major defection came from Alfred Adler, who had become uncomfortable with Freud's emphasis on sexual motivation. Adler argued that the fundamental human drive was not sexual, but rather the will to power, the desire to overcome feelings of inferiority and achieve dominance. This disagreement might seem minor, but it struck at the heart of Freudian theory. Freud's response to Adler's challenge revealed a side of his personality that many followers found disturbing. He could not tolerate dissent within his ranks, could not accept that his theories might be incomplete or require modification. Instead, he demanded absolute loyalty and orthodoxy from his disciples, treating any deviation as a personal betrayal. The break with Adler was painful but manageable. Adler was respected but not beloved within the psychoanalytic movement, and his departure did not threaten the fundamental structure of the organization Freud was building. But the conflict with Jung would prove far more devastating, because Jung had been more than just a follower. He had been Freud's chosen successor, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. Jung's rebellion began subtly, with small disagreements about theoretical details that gradually expanded into fundamental philosophical differences. Jung was uncomfortable with Freud's materialistic worldview and his reduction of all psychological phenomena to sexual causes. He was drawn to mysticism, to the spiritual dimensions of human experience, and to the possibility that the unconscious mind might contain more than just repressed sexual desires. The relationship between Freud and Jung had always been complex, mixing genuine intellectual admiration with deeper psychological tensions. Freud saw in Jung the son he had never had in his own family, a brilliant heir who could carry his work into the future. Jung, for his part, struggled with the burden of being Freud's chosen successor while also trying to develop his own original ideas. Their correspondence during this period reads like a psychological thriller, full of veiled threats, wounded feelings, and barely suppressed hostility. Freud accused Jung of abandoning scientific rigour for mystical nonsense. Jung countered that Freud was trapped in a narrow materialism that blinded him to the spiritual dimensions of human experience. The final break came in 1913, and it was devastating for both men. Freud lost his most gifted disciple and his designated successor. Jung lost his mentor and father figure, the man who had opened up new worlds of psychological understanding. But perhaps more importantly, the psychoanalytic movement lost its unity and began to fragment into competing schools of thought. These personal and professional upheavals coincided with broader changes in European society that would soon engulf the entire continent in unprecedented violence. The old order that had dominated Europe for centuries was beginning to crack, and new forces were emerging that would reshape the political and social landscape. Freud watched these developments with growing alarm. He had always been interested in the psychological roots of social phenomena, but the approaching war forced him to confront questions about human nature that he had previously avoided. If civilization was supposed to tame humanity's primitive instincts, why did entire nations seem eager to tear each other apart? The outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered whatever remained of 19th century optimism about human progress and moral evolution. Freud, like most Europeans, initially supported his nation's war effort, but he quickly became disillusioned as the conflict dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer. The war years were difficult for Freud, personally and professionally. His practice dwindled as wealthy patients fled Vienna or were called to military service. Food became scarce, heating fuel was rationed, and the comfortable bourgeois lifestyle he had worked so hard to achieve gradually crumbled around him. But the war also provided Freud with new insights into human psychology. He began treating soldiers suffering from what was then called war neurosis, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. These men had experienced traumas so severe that their minds had essentially shut down, leaving them unable to function in normal society. Working with these war victims, Freud developed new theories about the relationship between trauma and repetition. He noticed that his patients seemed compelled to relive their traumatic experiences, either in dreams or through compulsive behaviors. This observation led him to formulate what he called the repetition compulsion, the idea that humans are driven to repeat painful experiences in an attempt to master them psychologically. This concept, in turn, led Freud to one of his most controversial theoretical innovations, the death drive. He began to argue that, alongside the life instincts that drive us toward pleasure and survival, there exists an equally powerful death instinct that pulls us toward destruction and dissolution. This dark vision of human motivation reflected the impact that years of war and suffering had on his thinking. The war also forced Freud to reconsider his understanding of civilization itself. He had always believed that culture and education could gradually tame humanity's primitive instincts, but the barbarity he witnessed during the conflict convinced him that civilization was a much more fragile achievement than he had previously supposed. As the war finally ended in 1918, Freud found himself in a transformed world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, taking with it the social order that had shaped his entire life. Vienna was now the capital of a small, impoverished republic rather than a great empire. Anti-Semitism, which had always been present but relatively restrained, began to emerge more openly as economic hardship increased social tensions. But despite these challenges, Freud's international reputation continued to grow. His books were being translated into multiple languages, psychoanalytic societies were forming in cities across Europe and America, and a new generation of intellectuals was discovering in his work a key to understanding the complexities of modern life. The 1920s brought both triumph and tragedy to Freud's personal life. His eldest daughter, Matilda, married and began to give him the grandchildren who would become a source of great joy in his later years. His son, Martin, served as a soldier during the war and returned home safely, though changed by his experiences. But it was his youngest daughter, Anna, who would prove most important to his legacy. Anna had always been Freud's favourite child, and she began to show an interest in psychoanalysis that delighted her father. Unlike his sons, who pursued conventional careers in law and business, Anna seemed destined to carry on his intellectual work. Anna's entry into psychoanalysis represented more than just professional succession. She began to specialise in child analysis, developing techniques for working with young patients that extended her father's theories into new territory. Through Anna's work, Freud gained new insights into childhood development and the formation of personality that enriched and complicated his understanding of human psychology. During this period, Freud also began work on some of his most ambitious theoretical projects. He started writing what would become The Ego and the Id, a book that would fundamentally restructure psychoanalytic theory by introducing a new model of the human psyche. In this new model, Freud divided the mind into three components: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id represented the primitive, instinctual part of the personality that operates according to the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification without regard for consequences. The superego represented the internalized moral standards and ideals that we acquire from our parents and society, and the ego represented the rational, reality-oriented part of the personality that must mediate between the demands of the id and the constraints of the superego. This structural model was more sophisticated and nuanced than Freud's earlier theories, acknowledging that human psychology involves constant conflict between competing forces rather than simple repression of sexual desires. It also provided a framework for understanding how personality develops and how psychological problems arise. But even as Freud was refining his theories and building his international reputation, he was facing new challenges that would test his resilience and determination. The rise of fascism in Europe was creating an atmosphere of political extremism and racial hatred that threatened everything he had worked to achieve. In 1923, Freud noticed a growth in his mouth that his physician initially dismissed as insignificant, but the growth persisted, and further examination revealed that it was cancerous. The diagnosis was devastating. Freud was suffering from cancer of the jaw, a disease that would plague him for the remaining 16 years of his life. The cancer required multiple surgeries, including operations that removed parts of his jaw and palate. These procedures left him in constant pain and made eating and speaking difficult. He was fitted with a prosthetic device that he called the Monster, which helped him speak but caused continuous discomfort. Despite his physical suffering, Freud continued to work with remarkable determination. He maintained his practice, continued his writing, and kept up an extensive correspondence with followers around the world. His productivity during these cancer years was extraordinary, including some of his most important late works. The disease also deepened his thinking about mortality and the human condition. He began to write more philosophically about religion, culture, and the future of civilization. His late works, including The Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents, reflected a man grappling with fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. Civilization and Its Discontents, published in 1930, was perhaps his most pessimistic work. In it, Freud argued that civilization requires individuals to suppress their natural instincts, creating a fundamental tension between personal happiness and social order. The price of civilization, he suggested, is a certain amount of neurosis and unhappiness that can never be completely eliminated. This grim assessment reflected not just his personal suffering, but also his growing awareness of the political dangers facing Europe. The rise of Hitler in Germany and the spread of fascist movements across the continent convinced Freud that his pessimistic view of human nature was being confirmed by contemporary events. As the 1930s progressed, the situation for Jews in German-speaking Europe became increasingly precarious. Nazi ideology specifically targeted psychoanalysis as a Jewish corruption of German culture, and Freud's books were among those burned in public ceremonies. Former students and colleagues in Germany were forced to flee or faced imprisonment. For years, Freud resisted suggestions that he should leave Vienna. Despite everything, Austria was his home, and he could not imagine living anywhere else. He continued to believe that his age and international reputation would protect him from the worst excesses of anti-Semitic persecution. But the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1938 made his position untenable. Within days of the Anschluss, Nazi officials were searching his apartment and threatening his family. His books were banned, his assets were frozen, and it became clear that his life was in danger. The decision to flee Vienna was agonizing for the 82-year-old Freud. He was leaving behind not just his home, but the entire world that had shaped his identity and his work. The city where he had spent most of his life, where he had developed his theories and built his reputation, was now closed to him forever. The escape to London was arranged by devoted followers and admirers who recognized that preserving Freud's life was essential to preserving his legacy. The journey was difficult for a man weakened by cancer and age, but it represented hope for a future that had seemed impossible just months earlier. In London, Freud found refuge in a house in Marsfield Gardens that would become his final home. Despite his illness and the trauma of exile, he attempted to reconstruct something resembling his old life. He set up a consulting room, continued his writing, and received visitors from around the world who came to pay their respects to the founder of psychoanalysis. But by now, the cancer had progressed to a point where further treatment was futile. Freud was in constant pain, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The man who had spent his life exploring the mysteries of the human mind was now facing the ultimate mystery that awaits us all. As 1939 dawned, Freud's body was failing him, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The cancer had spread throughout his jaw and throat, making even the simple act of swallowing a torment. Yet in those final months in London, surrounded by his books and the artifacts he had collected during his lifetime, he continued to wrestle with the deepest questions about human existence. The house in Marsfield Gardens became a pilgrimage site for intellectuals from around the world. Writers, philosophers, and scientists came to sit with the aging master, hoping to glean some final wisdom from the man who had revolutionized our understanding of the human condition. Among these visitors was Salvador Dali, the surrealist painter who had been deeply influenced by Freudian theories about dreams and the unconscious. Freud was fascinated by Dali's work, seeing in the artist's bizarre dreamscapes a visual representation of the unconscious processes he had spent decades trying to describe in words. The meeting between the elderly psychoanalyst and the flamboyant painter represented a passing of the torch from one generation to the next, from the scientific exploration of the unconscious to its artistic expression. But even as visitors came to honor him, Freud was engaged in one final battle with his own disciples over the future of psychoanalysis. He had always been a controlling figure within the movement, insisting on orthodoxy and punishing deviation. Now, facing his own mortality, he struggled with questions about who would carry on his work and how his theories might evolve after his death. Anna Freud had emerged as her father's most trusted lieutenant and likely successor. She had developed her own expertise in child psychology and had proven herself capable of defending psychoanalytic principles against criticism. But Freud worried that the movement might fragment after his death, splitting into competing factions that would dilute or distort his original insights. His concerns were not unfounded. Already, different schools of psychoanalytic thought were emerging in America and Europe, each emphasizing different aspects of his work while downplaying others. Some followers focused on the social and cultural dimensions of psychology, while others concentrated on the biological foundations of mental life. The unity that Freud had fought so hard to maintain was beginning to fracture. The political situation in Europe continued to deteriorate throughout 1939. The invasion of Poland in September marked the beginning of World War II, a conflict that would prove even more devastating than the Great War that had so profoundly influenced Freud's thinking about human nature. From his exile in London, he watched as the continent descended into barbarism that seemed to confirm his darkest theories about civilization and its discontents. The war also brought personal anguish. 4 of his sisters remained in Vienna, unable or unwilling to flee when the opportunity arose. Freud knew that their fate under Nazi rule would likely be tragic, and this knowledge added to his physical suffering. The man who had spent his life analysing the psychological roots of human cruelty was now witnessing its systematic application on an unprecedented scale. During these final months, Freud found himself reflecting on the strange trajectory his life had taken. He had begun as a young researcher interested in the nervous systems of fish and eels, driven by simple scientific curiosity about the natural world. Through a series of seemingly random events and personal encounters, he had been led into the labyrinth of the human psyche, where he had discovered forces and drives that challenged everything conventional wisdom believed about human nature. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest discoveries had emerged from his own psychological struggles. His analysis of his relationship with his father had led to the Oedipus complex. His investigation of his own dreams had revealed the mechanisms of unconscious wish fulfillment. His examination of his neurotic symptoms had uncovered the role of repression in mental life. In trying to understand himself, he had inadvertently mapped the territory of the human soul. But Freud also recognized that his work was incomplete. He had opened doors into the unconscious mind, but he had not fully explored what lay beyond those doors. He had identified fundamental drives and conflicts that shape human behavior, but he had not solved the puzzle of how individuals and societies might better manage these forces. He had diagnosed the human condition, but he had not provided a cure. These reflections led him to consider the broader implications of his work for the future of humanity. Psychoanalysis had revealed the dark side of human nature, the primitive instincts and violent impulses that civilization struggles to contain. But it had also shown that these forces could be understood, analysed, and potentially redirected toward more constructive ends. The therapeutic relationship itself demonstrated this possibility. In the consulting room, patients could explore their deepest fears and desires without judgment, gradually learning to understand and manage their psychological conflicts. The process was slow and often painful, but it offered hope that human beings might gradually become more conscious of their motivations and more capable of rational choice. Freud began to envision a future in which psychoanalytic insights might be applied not just to individual therapy, but to education, child rearing, and social organization. If children could be raised with greater awareness of their psychological development, if teachers could understand the unconscious dynamics of learning, if political leaders could recognize the irrational forces that drive social conflict, then perhaps humanity might slowly evolve toward greater wisdom and maturity. This vision was both optimistic and pessimistic. Optimistic because it suggested that human nature was not fixed and unchangeable, that consciousness and understanding could gradually triumph over blind instinct. Pessimistic because it acknowledged that this process would be extraordinarily slow and difficult, requiring generations of patient work to achieve even modest improvements. As winter approached, Freud's condition worsened dramatically. The cancer had made eating almost impossible, and he was losing weight rapidly. Sleep became elusive as pain racked his body throughout the night. Yet he continued to receive patients and work on his writing, driven by an almost superhuman determination to use every remaining moment productively. His final completed work was Moses and Monotheism, a book that applied psychoanalytic methods to the study of Jewish history and religion. In it, Freud argued that Moses was actually an Egyptian who imposed monotheistic beliefs on the Hebrew people, and that the guilt over Moses' murder by his followers had shaped Jewish consciousness for millennia. The book was controversial even among Freud's supporters, but it demonstrated his continued willingness to challenge conventional beliefs regardless of personal cost. The writing of this book also represented a final reconciliation with his Jewish identity. Throughout his life, Freud had maintained a complex relationship with his heritage, proud of Jewish intellectual achievements, but uncomfortable with religious orthodoxy. In his final work, he seemed to be acknowledging that his Jewish background had profoundly shaped his psychological theories, even when he was not consciously aware of this influence. By early 1939, it became clear that Freud was entering the final phase of his illness. The cancer had progressed beyond any possibility of treatment, and his physicians could offer nothing but palliative care. The man who had spent his career analysing the psychological defences people construct against the fear of death now had to confront his own mortality without illusion or denial. His response to this ultimate challenge was characteristically rational and controlled. He had always believed that human beings should face reality directly, no matter how painful, and he was determined to practice what he had preached. He refused to take refuge in religious consolation or false hope, choosing instead to meet death with the same analytical clarity he had brought to life. On September 21st, 1939, Freud asked his personal physician, Max Schur, to help him end his suffering. He had extracted a promise from Schur years earlier that when the time came, the doctor would assist him in dying with dignity rather than allowing him to endure meaningless agony. The request was made calmly and rationally, in keeping with Freud's lifelong commitment to reason over emotion. Schur administered morphine injections over the next 2 days, gradually increasing the dosage until Freud slipped into unconsciousness. He died peacefully on September 23, 1939, surrounded by his family and closest associates. The man who had revolutionized our understanding of the human mind had chosen the manner and timing of his own departure from life. The funeral was a modest affair, reflecting both Freud's personal preferences and the wartime conditions that prevailed in London. Representatives from the psychoanalytic community gathered to pay their respects, but the ceremony was subdued and private. His body was cremated, and his ashes were placed in an ancient Greek urn from his collection of antiquities, a fitting resting place for a man who had spent his life excavating the buried treasures of the human psyche. News of Freud's death was overshadowed by the war that was then engulfing Europe. The newspapers that reported his passing were filled with accounts of military campaigns and political developments that seemed more immediately urgent than the death of an elderly psychologist. Yet those who understood the significance of his work recognized that one of the most influential thinkers of the modern era had passed from the scene. The timing of Freud's death was symbolically appropriate. He died just as the world was descending into a conflict that would demonstrate the very forces he had spent his life studying. The Holocaust that would soon claim the lives of his 4 sisters represented the triumph of exactly the kind of primitive hatred and irrationality that psychoanalysis sought to understand and ultimately overcome. But even in death, Freud's influence continued to grow. The war that drove him from Vienna also scattered his followers across the globe, carrying psychoanalytic ideas to new countries and cultures. Anna Freud established herself as a leading figure in child psychology. Other disciples founded institutes and training programs that would ensure the survival and development of psychoanalytic thought. In the decades following his death, Freud's theories would be challenged, revised, and sometimes rejected by new generations of psychologists and psychiatrists. Critics would argue that his methods were unscientific, his theories were unprovable, and his emphasis on sexuality was excessive. Feminists would challenge his views about women, anthropologists would question his assumptions about primitive societies, and neuroscientists would offer alternative explanations for the phenomena he had studied. Yet despite these criticisms, the fundamental insights of psychoanalysis proved remarkably durable. The idea that much of human behaviour is motivated by unconscious forces, that childhood experiences shape adult personality, that psychological conflicts can produce physical symptoms, and that talking about problems can provide therapeutic relief, all became accepted parts of modern psychological understanding. Perhaps more importantly, Freud had fundamentally changed how human beings think about themselves. Before psychoanalysis, people generally assumed that they understood their own motivations and could trust their conscious thoughts and feelings. Freud demonstrated that this assumption was false, that we are largely strangers to ourselves, driven by forces we neither understand nor control. This insight was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggested that people were not entirely responsible for their thoughts and actions, that much of what they did was the product of unconscious conflicts rather than deliberate choice. Terrifying because it implied that rational consciousness, which humans had always considered their greatest achievement, was actually a fragile vessel floating on an ocean of primitive impulses and irrational desires. The cultural impact of this revelation extended far beyond the realm of psychology. Writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf experimented with stream of consciousness techniques that reflected Freudian insights about the workings of the mind. Artists like the Surrealists sought to tap into unconscious creativity through automatic drawing and dream imagery. Political theorists began to analyze the psychological roots of fascism and mass movements. Even popular culture was transformed by psychoanalytic ideas. The notion that everyone has hidden psychological depths, that behavior can be interpreted symbolically, that relationships are shaped by unconscious patterns established in childhood, all became common assumptions in literature, film, and everyday conversation. Freudian concepts like repression, projection, and sublimation entered the popular vocabulary. The therapeutic relationship that Freud pioneered also evolved and spread throughout society. The idea that talking to a trained professional could help people understand and resolve their psychological problems became widely accepted, leading to the development of numerous forms of psychotherapy. While these newer approaches often departed significantly from classical psychoanalysis, they all owed a debt to Freud's original insight that psychological healing could occur through verbal exploration of mental conflicts. In academic psychology, Freud's influence took more complex forms. While few contemporary psychologists accept his theories in their original form, many of his core insights have been validated by empirical research. Studies have confirmed that much mental processing occurs outside conscious awareness, that early childhood experiences do influence later development, and that psychological factors can indeed affect physical health. Modern neuroscience has provided new ways of understanding the phenomena that Freud studied. Brain imaging techniques have revealed the neural basis of unconscious processing, while studies of memory have shown how traumatic experiences can be both forgotten and recalled. These scientific advances have sometimes supported and sometimes contradicted Freudian theories, but they have generally confirmed his basic insight that the mind is far more complex than it appears on the surface. The institutional legacy of psychoanalysis has proven equally enduring. Training institutes founded by Freud's followers continue to operate around the world, preparing new generations of analysts to carry on the therapeutic work he began. Professional organizations maintain standards and promote research, ensuring that psychoanalytic knowledge continues to develop and evolve. Perhaps most significantly, Freud established the principle that human psychological suffering deserves serious scientific attention and systematic treatment. Before psychoanalysis, mental illness was often seen as a moral failing or divine punishment. Freud demonstrated that psychological problems could be understood as the result of identifiable causes and could potentially be addressed through rational intervention. This medicalization of mental distress had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it reduced stigma and encouraged people to seek help for psychological problems. On the negative side, It sometimes led to an oversimplified view of mental illness as merely a medical condition that could be cured through technical intervention. The political implications of Freudian theory also proved significant. His analysis of the psychological roots of authoritarianism and mass movements influenced post-war efforts to understand and prevent fascism. The Frankfurt School of Social Criticism drew heavily on psychoanalytic concepts to analyze the psychological appeal of totalitarian ideologies. At the same time, psychoanalysis became controversial in some circles precisely because of its political implications. Conservative critics argued that Freudian theories undermined traditional moral values by suggesting that people were not fully responsible for their actions. Marxist critics claimed that psychoanalysis distracted attention from economic and social causes of human suffering by focusing on individual psychological conflicts. The feminist movement had a particularly complex relationship with Freudian theory. While many feminists criticized Freud's views about women as outdated and sexist, others found useful insights in his analysis of how gender identity is formed through early childhood experiences. The result was a rich body of feminist psychoanalytic theory that both built upon and challenged Freud's original insights. As the 20th century progressed, new schools of psychological thought emerged that offered alternatives to classical psychoanalysis. Behaviorism focused on observable actions rather than unconscious motivations. Humanistic psychology emphasized human potential and self-actualization rather than psychological conflict. Cognitive psychology studied mental processes like memory and perception rather than unconscious drives. Yet even as these new approaches gained prominence, psychoanalytic thinking continued to evolve and adapt. Object relations theory explored how early relationships shape later psychological development. Ego psychology focused on the adaptive functions of consciousness rather than the disruptive effects of unconscious conflict. Self-psychology examined how people develop and maintain a coherent sense of identity. These developments demonstrated the continuing vitality of psychoanalytic thought, while also showing how far it had moved from Freud's original formulations. The rigid orthodoxy that Freud had tried to maintain during his lifetime gave way to a more pluralistic approach that welcomed diverse perspectives and theoretical innovations. Today, more than 8 decades after Freud's death, his legacy remains complex and contested. Few mental health professionals practice classical psychoanalysis in its original form, but psychoanalytic concepts continue to influence therapeutic practice across a wide range of approaches. The talking cure that Freud pioneered has evolved into dozens of different forms of psychotherapy, each offering its own perspective on how psychological healing occurs. In the broader culture, Freudian ideas have become so thoroughly integrated into common understanding that we often take them for granted. The notion that people have unconscious motivations, that childhood experiences matter, that dreams might be meaningful, all seem like common sense rather than revolutionary insights. This cultural assimilation represents perhaps the greatest testament to Freud's influence. The scientific status of psychoanalytic theory remains a matter of ongoing debate. Critics argue that many Freudian concepts cannot be empirically tested and therefore fall outside the realm of legitimate science. Supporters counter that psychoanalysis deals with subjective experiences that cannot be easily quantified but are nonetheless real and important. This tension between scientific rigor and clinical insight reflects a broader challenge in psychology and psychiatry. How do we balance the demand for empirical validation with the need to address the full complexity of human experience? How do we develop theories that are both scientifically credible and therapeutically useful? Freud himself was deeply committed to scientific methodology, but he was also willing to follow his clinical observations wherever they led, even when they took him into territory that could not be easily verified through conventional experimental methods. This willingness to explore the unknown while maintaining scientific standards became a defining characteristic of psychoanalytic investigation. The man who began his career studying the reproductive organs of eels ended up mapping the deepest territories of the human soul. His journey from neurological researcher to psychoanalytic pioneer illustrates the unpredictable paths that scientific discovery can take. Sometimes the most important insights emerge not from systematic investigation, but from the willingness to follow unexpected clues wherever they might lead. The intellectual revolution that Freud had sparked was beginning to take on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the confines of his Viennese consulting room and into domains he could never have anticipated. As the 1920s roared to life around him, the aging psychoanalyst found himself grappling with the strange phenomenon of watching his ideas become cultural currency, traded and transformed in ways that both thrilled and alarmed him. Hollywood had discovered psychoanalysis, and the results were as fascinating as they were disturbing. Silent films began featuring mysterious characters whose actions were driven by hidden psychological motivations. Directors like G.W. Pabst created movies that explicitly drew on Freudian themes, exploring the dark undercurrents of human desire that polite society preferred to ignore. The cinema, that new art form of the masses, was becoming a vehicle for psychoanalytic education, reaching audiences that would never read a scientific paper or enter a therapist's office. But this popularization came with a price. Complex theoretical concepts were simplified into dramatic plot devices. The nuanced understanding of unconscious conflict that Freud had spent decades developing was reduced to crude explanations for criminal behavior or sexual dysfunction. He watched with mixed feelings as his life's work was transformed into entertainment, simultaneously gratified by its reach and horrified by its distortion. The literary world had embraced psychoanalytic concepts with even greater sophistication. Writers like Thomas Mann and Stefan Zweig were incorporating Freudian insights into their fiction, creating characters whose psychological depths reflected the new understanding of human motivation. James Joyce's revolutionary novel Ulysses employed stream-of-consciousness techniques that seemed to capture the very flow of unconscious thought that Freud had tried to access through free association. These artistic applications of psychoanalytic theory represented something unprecedented in the history of ideas. Previous scientific discoveries had typically remained within their original domains, influencing related fields but rarely transforming the broader culture. But psychoanalysis was different because it dealt with the fundamental nature of human experience, touching on questions that concerned everyone, regardless of their scientific training. The surrealist movement in art had perhaps the most direct connection to Freudian theory. Artists like André Breton and Max Ernst sought to bypass conscious control and tap directly into unconscious creativity. They experimented with automatic drawing, dream imagery, and free association, trying to create art that would reveal the hidden workings of the mind. Their paintings and sculptures became visual representations of the psychological landscapes that Freud had mapped through verbal analysis. Salvador Dalí became obsessed with Freudian symbolism, filling his canvases with melting clocks, distorted bodies, and bizarre juxtapositions that seemed to emerge directly from the world of dreams and fantasies. When he finally met Freud in London during the master's final year, the encounter represented a meeting between the scientific explorer of the unconscious and its artistic interpreter. But the cultural impact of psychoanalysis extended far beyond the arts. Advertising agencies began employing psychological techniques to appeal to unconscious desires and motivations. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, pioneered the field of public relations by applying psychoanalytic insights to mass persuasion. He understood that people's purchasing decisions were driven not just by rational considerations, but by deeper psychological needs and fears. The transformation of advertising from simple product promotion to sophisticated psychological manipulation represented one of the more troubling applications of Freudian theory. If unconscious desires could be identified and exploited for commercial purposes, what did this mean for human autonomy and free will? Freud had revealed the hidden forces that shape human behavior, but he had not anticipated how this knowledge might be used to control and manipulate those forces. Educational theory was also being revolutionized by psychoanalytic insights. Progressive educators like A.S. Neal founded schools based on the principle that children should be free to express their natural impulses rather than having them suppressed through rigid discipline. The Summerhill School in England became a laboratory for educational methods that took seriously the psychological needs of developing children. These experimental approaches to education reflected a broader shift in thinking about childhood that psychoanalysis had initiated. If adult neuroses could be traced back to childhood traumas and repressions, then perhaps mental health could be preserved through more enlightened child-rearing practices. Parents began to worry about the psychological impact of their disciplinary methods, sometimes swinging from authoritarian control to permissive indulgence. The medical profession itself was slowly beginning to acknowledge the psychological dimensions of physical illness. Doctors were recognizing that emotional stress could contribute to conditions ranging from heart disease to digestive disorders. The mind-body connection that Freud had explored through his work with hysterical patients was being validated through clinical observation in hospitals and medical practices around the world. Anthropologists were applying psychoanalytic concepts to their studies of primitive cultures, seeking to understand how different societies managed the universal psychological conflicts that Freud had identified. Bronisław Malinowski's research among the Trobriand islanders challenged some of Freud's assumptions about the universality of the Oedipal complex, suggesting that family structures and social organization could influence psychological development in unexpected ways. These cross-cultural studies raised important questions about the relationship between individual psychology and social environment. If psychological patterns that seemed fundamental in Vienna were absent or modified in other cultures, what did this mean for the universal validity of psychoanalytic theory? Freud found himself defending his insights against critics who argued that he had mistaken the neuroses of bourgeois European society for universal human characteristics. The rise of fascism in Europe provided a tragic laboratory for testing psychoanalytic theories about group psychology and social pathology. The mass rallies, the cult of personality around dictatorial leaders, and the systematic dehumanization of minority groups all seem to confirm Freud's darkest insights about the primitive forces lurking beneath civilized society. Wilhelm Reich, one of Freud's former students, attempted to develop a specifically political application of psychoanalytic theory, arguing that fascism appealed to people whose sexual and emotional development had been distorted by authoritarian family structures. His work suggested that psychological liberation and political freedom were intimately connected, that personal therapy and social revolution might be two aspects of the same process. But Freud himself remained skeptical of attempts to transform psychoanalysis into a political movement. He believed that his discoveries were scientific rather than ideological, that they revealed truths about human nature rather than prescriptions for social change. This tension between psychoanalysis as science and psychoanalysis as social criticism would continue to complicate the movement throughout its history. The institutionalization of psychoanalysis was proceeding rapidly during this period. Training institutes were being established in major cities across Europe and America, each developing its own interpretation of Freudian theory and practice. The International Psychoanalytic Association, founded in 1910, was struggling to maintain unity and standards as the movement grew and diversified. Freud watched these developments with the mixed feelings of a parent watching children leave home. He was proud of how far his ideas had travelled and how deeply they had penetrated modern culture. But he was also concerned about maintaining the scientific rigour and therapeutic effectiveness that had been the foundation of his work. The training of new analysts had become a particularly complex challenge. Unlike other medical specialties that could be learned through textbook study and supervised practice, psychoanalysis required practitioners to undergo their own analysis, to experience firsthand the process they would later guide others through. This requirement for personal therapy as part of professional training was unprecedented in medicine and reflected the unique nature of psychoanalytic work. The relationship between analyst and patient, which Freud had discovered to be crucial to therapeutic success, could not be easily standardized or regulated. It required a level of emotional engagement and psychological sophistication that went far beyond conventional medical training. The selection and education of analysts became an art form in itself, requiring careful attention to personality, character, and psychological development. Anna Freud had emerged as one of the most influential figures in this educational process. Her work with children had demonstrated that psychoanalytic principles could be adapted to different populations and developmental stages. She was also proving herself to be a skilled organizational leader, capable of managing the complex institutional politics that surrounded the psychoanalytic movement. But the rapid expansion of psychoanalysis was also creating new problems and challenges. As the movement grew, it began to attract people whose motivations were not purely scientific or therapeutic. Some were drawn by the prestige and mystery surrounding psychoanalytic practice. Others were seeking personal healing or insight rather than professional expertise. Still others were attracted by the bohemian lifestyle and intellectual excitement that surrounded psychoanalytic circles. This diversification of the psychoanalytic community created tensions that Freud found increasingly difficult to manage. He had always been a demanding leader who expected absolute loyalty and adherence to his theoretical formulations. But as the movement grew beyond his direct control, maintaining such orthodoxy became impossible. The problem was compounded by the fact that psychoanalytic theory was still evolving and developing. New clinical observations were constantly challenging existing formulations, requiring modifications and refinements that Freud was not always willing to accept. His own theoretical development had slowed as he aged, but younger analysts were continuing to push the boundaries of understanding in directions that sometimes conflicted with his established views. The question of what constituted legitimate psychoanalytic practice became increasingly contentious. Should analysts be required to follow Freud's methods exactly, or could they modify techniques based on their own clinical experience? How much theoretical deviation could be tolerated before a practitioner was no longer considered a true psychoanalyst? These questions would continue to plague the movement long after Freud's death. The commercialization of psychoanalysis was another source of concern. In America particularly, psychoanalytic practice was becoming lucrative, attracting practitioners whose primary motivation was financial rather than scientific. The long-term nature of psychoanalytic treatment made it expensive, limiting access to wealthy patients and raising questions about the social utility of the method. Freud had always been ambivalent about the therapeutic aspects of his work. While he genuinely wanted to help his patients, his primary interest was in understanding the workings of the human mind rather than providing treatment. He worried that the emphasis on therapy might distract from the scientific investigation that he considered most important. The relationship between psychoanalysis and other forms of medicine was also becoming strained. many physicians remained skeptical of psychoanalytic methods and theories, viewing them as unscientific and potentially harmful. The fact that successful psychoanalytic practice seemed to require qualities like intuition, empathy, and psychological sophistication that were difficult to teach or measure made it suspect in the eyes of more conventionally trained doctors. This tension was particularly acute in America, where the medical establishment was more rigidly organized and scientifically oriented than in Europe. American physicians who wanted to practice psychoanalysis often found themselves caught between the demands of medical orthodoxy and psychoanalytic innovation. The result was a series of bitter disputes about training requirements, professional standards, and the relationship between psychoanalysis and medicine. Despite these challenges and controversies, the fundamental appeal of psychoanalytic insights continued to drive the movement forward. People from all walks of life were discovering that Freudian concepts helped them understand aspects of their experience that had previously been mysterious or inexplicable. The idea that human behavior was motivated by unconscious forces, that childhood experiences shaped adult personality, and that talking about problems could provide relief, all resonated with individuals struggling to make sense of their lives. The Great Depression, that began in 1929, provided a new context for understanding the social applications of psychoanalytic theory. The economic collapse seemed to validate Freud's pessimistic assessment of civilization's fragility, demonstrating how quickly the rational structures of society could crumble under psychological and social pressure. The mass unemployment, social displacement, and political upheaval that characterized the 1930s created conditions that psychoanalysts were uniquely equipped to understand. The psychological impact of economic insecurity, the role of unconscious fears in political behavior, and the relationship between individual mental health and social stability all became pressing concerns that drew on psychoanalytic insights. But the Depression also highlighted some of the limitations of psychoanalytic approaches to human problems. While individual therapy might help people understand and cope with their personal difficulties, it offered little direct assistance to those struggling with poverty, unemployment, or social discrimination. Critics argued that psychoanalysis was a luxury for the wealthy that distracted attention from more pressing material needs. This criticism would become increasingly important as political movements on both the left and right gained strength throughout the 1930s. Marxist critics argued that psychoanalysis was a bourgeois indulgence that prevented people from recognizing the economic roots of their suffering. Fascist critics denounced it as a Jewish corruption of Germanic values. Both attacks reflected the political tensions that were building toward another world war. Freud found himself in the peculiar position of being simultaneously too radical and too conservative for the polarized political climate of the 1930s. His insights into human irrationality and primitive motivation were too disturbing for conservatives who wanted to maintain traditional beliefs about human nature. But his emphasis on individual psychology rather than social action was too limited for radicals who wanted to transform society. As the decade progressed and the political situation in Europe deteriorated, Freud's age and illness increasingly limited his ability to respond to these challenges. The man who had once been at the center of every controversy surrounding psychoanalysis was becoming a revered but somewhat distant figure, more symbol than active participant in the movement he had created. The rise of Hitler in Germany represented a personal as well as professional crisis for Freud. The Nazi ideology specifically targeted psychoanalysis as a manifestation of Jewish degeneracy, and many of his former students and colleagues were forced to flee Germany or face persecution. The systematic destruction of psychoanalytic institutions and the burning of psychoanalytic books represented an assault on everything he had worked to build. But the Nazi persecution also demonstrated the power and importance of psychoanalytic insights. The fact that totalitarian movements felt threatened by psychological understanding suggested that self-knowledge and critical thinking were indeed dangerous to authoritarian control. The attempt to suppress psychoanalysis, paradoxically, validated its significance as a tool for human liberation and understanding. As Freud entered his final years, he could look back on a life that had fundamentally changed how human beings understand themselves. The young researcher who had dissected eels in a Vienna laboratory had become one of the most influential thinkers in human history, someone whose ideas had penetrated every aspect of modern culture. But he could also see that his work was far from complete. The mysteries of human psychology that he had begun to unravel remained largely unsolved. The therapeutic methods he had developed were still crude and limited in their effectiveness. The social applications of psychoanalytic theory were still largely unexplored. There was so much more to be discovered and understood. The legacy he would leave was not a finished system of knowledge, but a method of investigation, a way of looking at human behavior that revealed hidden depths and unexpected connections. He had taught the world to question surface appearances, to look for unconscious motivations, and to take seriously the psychological dimensions of human experience. The revolution he had started would continue long after his death, carried forward by his students and followers who would extend his insights into new territories and apply them to new problems. The talking cure would evolve into dozens of different therapeutic approaches. The theory of unconscious motivation would be refined and modified by new research. The analysis of dreams and symbols would inspire new forms of art and literature. But perhaps most importantly, Freud had established the principle that human psychological suffering deserves serious attention and systematic investigation. He had shown that the mind could be studied scientifically, that psychological problems had identifiable causes, and that understanding could lead to healing. As he faced his final illness with characteristic courage and rationality, Freud could take satisfaction in knowing that he had fundamentally altered the human conversation about what it means to be human. The questions he had raised would continue to challenge and inspire future generations of thinkers, researchers, and healers. The boy who had watched his father's humiliation on a Vienna street had grown up to become the man who would help humanity understand the psychological forces that drive such cruelty and the hidden wounds it creates. In trying to make sense of his own experience, he had illuminated the dark corners of the human soul and shown that even in darkness, understanding and healing were possible. The death of Sigmund Freud marked not an ending, but a transformation. The man who had spent his life exploring the hidden chambers of the human psyche had become himself a figure of legend, his theories and discoveries spreading like ripples across the intellectual landscape of the 20th century. But the story of his influence was only beginning, and the world that would emerge from the ashes of the Second World War would prove to be fertile ground for the seeds he had planted. In the years immediately following his death, psychoanalysis underwent a dramatic metamorphosis. The war scattered his followers across the globe, carrying Freudian ideas to new continents and cultures where they would take root in unexpected ways. America, which had initially received psychoanalysis with enthusiasm, but also with a certain pragmatic skepticism, now became the new centre of psychoanalytic innovation and development. The American approach to Freudian theory was characteristically different from its European origins. Where Vienna had been contemplative and philosophical, New York was dynamic and practical. American analysts began modifying classical techniques to suit their patients' needs and their own cultural sensibilities. The rigid formality of traditional psychoanalytic sessions gave way to more flexible approaches that emphasized therapeutic results over theoretical purity. This adaptation was not without controversy. Orthodox Freudians argued that any deviation from the master's methods represented a betrayal of psychoanalytic principles. But younger practitioners contended that Freud himself had constantly evolved his techniques throughout his career, and that continued innovation was essential for the field's survival and growth. The tension between tradition and innovation would define psychoanalytic development for decades to come. Anna Freud, now established in London, had emerged as one of the most important guardians of her father's legacy. Her work with children had opened entirely new territories for psychoanalytic exploration, demonstrating that the principles of unconscious motivation and psychological development could be observed and treated even in very young patients. Her careful documentation of childhood defense mechanisms and developmental stages provided empirical support for many of her father's theoretical insights. But Anna Freud also faced significant challenges from other innovative thinkers within the psychoanalytic community. Melanie Klein, a pioneering child analyst working in London, had developed radically different ideas about early childhood development. Klein argued that psychological conflicts began much earlier than Freud had supposed, sometimes in the first few months of life. Her theories about infant psychology and the mother-child relationship represented a fundamental challenge to classical Freudian development theory. The disagreement between Anna Freud and Melanie Klein became known as the controversial discussions, a series of scientific debates within the British Psychoanalytic Society that revealed deep philosophical divisions within the movement. These debates were not merely academic disputes, but reflected fundamentally different views about human nature, the origins of psychological disturbance, and the proper methods of psychoanalytic treatment. Meanwhile, in America, a new generation of analysts was developing what came to be known as ego psychology. Influenced by Anna Freud's work on defense mechanisms, but going beyond it, theorists like Heinz Hartmann and Ernst Kreis began to focus on the adaptive functions of the ego rather than simply its conflicts with unconscious drives. This represented a significant shift from Freud's original emphasis on pathology toward a more optimistic view of human psychological potential. The ego psychology movement reflected broader changes in American society and culture. The post-war economic boom had created unprecedented prosperity and social mobility, fostering a more optimistic view of human nature and social progress. Americans were less interested in exploring the dark depths of unconscious conflict than in understanding how people could adapt successfully to modern life and achieve their full potential. This cultural shift was reflected in the emergence of new therapeutic approaches that drew on psychoanalytic insights while departing significantly from classical methods. Carl Rogers developed client-centered therapy, which emphasized the therapeutic relationship and the client's innate capacity for growth rather than the analyst's interpretive expertise. Fritz Perls created Gestalt therapy, which focused on present moment awareness rather than historical reconstruction of childhood conflicts. These new approaches represented both an extension and a critique of Freudian psychoanalysis. They accepted Freud's fundamental insight that psychological healing could occur through verbal exploration of mental conflicts, but they rejected his emphasis on sexual motivation and his pessimistic view of human nature. The result was a flowering of diverse therapeutic approaches that collectively came to be known as the human potential movement. The influence of psychoanalytic thinking was also spreading into unexpected areas of intellectual and cultural life. Anthropologists like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead were applying psychological concepts to their studies of different cultures, developing a new field called culture and personality studies. Their work suggested that psychological patterns that seemed universal in Western society might actually be products of specific cultural conditions. In the field of history, scholars began applying psychoanalytic methods to understand the psychological motivations of historical figures and the unconscious forces that shaped major historical events. Psychobiography emerged as a new genre that attempted to explain the actions of famous individuals through careful analysis of their psychological development and unconscious conflicts. Literary criticism was transformed by psychoanalytic insights as critics began to analyze the unconscious symbolism in great works of literature and the psychological motivations of fictional characters. The new criticism movement, while not explicitly Freudian, reflected the psychoanalytic emphasis on hidden meanings and symbolic interpretation. Writers and critics began to see literature as a form of collective dreaming that revealed the unconscious desires and conflicts of entire cultures. The visual arts continued to be influenced by psychoanalytic concepts, but in increasingly sophisticated ways. Abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock were experimenting with automatic techniques that seemed to bypass conscious control and tap directly into unconscious creativity. Their paintings became psychological landscapes that expressed emotional states rather than representing external reality. In the realm of popular culture, psychoanalytic ideas were becoming increasingly mainstream. Hollywood films began featuring psychoanalysts as characters, usually portrayed as wise healers who could unlock the secrets of troubled minds. Movies like Spellbound and The Three Faces of Eve introduced psychoanalytic concepts to mass audiences, though often in simplified or sensationalized forms. The popularization of psychoanalysis had both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, it reduced the stigma associated with mental illness and encouraged people to seek psychological help when they needed it. On the other hand, it sometimes led to superficial understanding of complex psychological processes and unrealistic expectations about what therapy could accomplish. The 1950s marked the golden age of psychoanalysis in America. Psychoanalytic training institutes were established in major cities across the country, and becoming a psychoanalyst carried enormous prestige within the medical community. Wealthy patients were willing to spend years in analysis, paying substantial fees for the privilege of exploring their unconscious minds with highly trained specialists. But this success also contained the seeds of future problems. The exclusivity and expense of psychoanalytic treatment limited its availability to a small privileged segment of society. Critics argued that psychoanalysis had become an indulgence for the wealthy rather than a genuine medical treatment. The long duration of classical analysis, often requiring sessions several times a week for many years, made it impractical for most people seeking psychological help. The development of psychiatric medications in the 1950s posed another challenge to psychoanalytic dominance. Drugs like chlorpromazine proved dramatically effective in treating severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, offering rapid relief from symptoms that had previously seemed intractable. This pharmaceutical revolution raised questions about whether psychological problems were best understood as medical conditions requiring chemical treatment rather than psychological conflicts requiring verbal exploration. The tension between biological and psychological approaches to mental illness reflected deeper philosophical questions about human nature that Freud had grappled with throughout his career. If mental illness could be treated with medications, what did this mean for theories about unconscious conflict and psychological causation? Were psychological symptoms merely the result of chemical imbalances in the brain, or did they reflect meaningful attempts by the psyche to cope with unbearable emotional realities? These questions became increasingly urgent as neuroscience began to provide detailed information about brain structure and function. Researchers discovered neurotransmitters, mapped neural pathways, and developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how the brain processes information and generates consciousness. This biological knowledge sometimes supported and sometimes contradicted psychoanalytic theories about mental functioning. The relationship between psychoanalysis and academic psychology also became increasingly strained during this period. Experimental psychologists criticized psychoanalytic methods as unscientific, arguing that Freudian theories could not be tested through controlled experiments and therefore fell outside the realm of legitimate scientific inquiry. They developed alternative approaches to understanding human behavior based on observable actions rather than inferred unconscious motivations. Behaviorism, led by figures like B.F. Skinner, offered a radically different view of human psychology that emphasized environmental conditioning rather than internal psychological conflicts. Behaviorists argued that most human problems could be solved through systematic application of learning principles rather than lengthy exploration of childhood memories and unconscious fantasies. And so ends the extraordinary journey of Sigmund Freud, a man whose restless curiosity about a childhood humiliation grew into a revolution that forever changed how we understand ourselves. From that 5-year-old boy watching his father's quiet submission on a Vienna street to the dying exile in London, who chose his final moment with characteristic rationality, Freud's life was a relentless pursuit of the hidden truths that govern human behavior. He gave us the unconscious, the talking cure, and the unsettling revelation that we are strangers to ourselves, driven by forces we barely comprehend. More than 8 decades after his death, we still live in the world he created, where dreams have meaning, childhood shapes destiny, and the examined life remains